Welcome back to Horns High Studios for another episode of True Crime Deep Cuts. I'm going to be discussing some issues with the Idaho 4 case when it comes to the DNA evidence and processing the crime scene. I know many of you have had questions about this as well from reading the comments section of the videos. I do as well. This is my 5th video in this new long form series. This is not a 666 seconds video. The stopwatch is not out. I'm talking about a topic that needs more time than that. It will be as long as it needs to be, but I know your time is valuable, so I won't waste it. Now, remember, it's important to remember with all my videos, these are for informational purposes only. These are just my opinions and speculation. I'm not saying anyone's guilty of anything. Everything I mention is alleged. Now, I've lined up a great guest to have on this episode. I have interviewed him multiple times for the Murder Metal Mayhem podcast. He's a former Australian federal police officer with 15 years of experience processing crime scenes. This would be very similar to our own FBI here in the United States. He's got a lot of knowledge about DNA as well. So I thought, what better person to bring in to talk about those issues as it relates to the Idaho 4 case. He'll be going by the name Mick, and his face will be hidden to protect his identity. I'll be using several clips from the interview I did with him just a couple of weeks ago. The entire interview is an hour long, and I may release it in its entirety after this episode comes out. I do use a lot of the interview here, so this will be a longer episode, but I felt the information Mick provides is really interesting, coming from a former law enforcement officer and investigator. I think the fact that he's from outside the U.S. gives him the opportunity to speak a little more freely about these things. So let's start at the beginning. I asked Mick about his law enforcement experience.
It depends on, which matter that we were involved in. So I've probably been involved in like the best part of half a dozen murders, from one, I suppose, involvement or another. So that can range from being, part of the investigative team. So, you're either the lead investigator or, their second, which we call a corroborator. So I've corroborated murders. I've worked as a forensic liaison. So because I've done some forensic courses in the past as well, I was a caveat between what the lead investigators were wanting and then what the forensic or crime scene investigators were actually there to collate. So we would receive, a briefing from the lead investigators about what they want done. They would not be there. It would just be a crime scene team come in and we would be, I suppose, the conduit between them. So we've got the forensic knowledge as well as obviously having the detective, or the investigative knowledge. When I was junior in my career, it involved everything from undertaking, surveillance to, door knocking to go around and, canvassing the community for any witnesses or any CCTV footage, right. Doing a sweep of the area to see whether or not, we've identified, access and egress points. So where people might have got in and then when they might have got away, how they would have gone. Right. So across the board, it's been, everything from, those junior sort of things when you first start, as a detective, you're just the lackey who gets to go and knock on people's doors right. and ask if they heard anything and do they have any, any CCTV cameras that might have been overlooking the street. Right. Through to actually being part of, some major investigations as part of the investigative team. So now that we've established Mick's experience and credentials, let's get into this Idaho 4 discussion. We know that the prosecution and mainstream media has touted the DNA evidence in this case. I know when I first heard that they had DNA from Brian Kohberger on the button snap of the K-bar knife sheath, I thought it was game over.
To me, that was all you needed to put someone away. But I had no idea how wrong I actually was. Unfortunately, there are many who follow this case that don't understand how flimsy that DNA evidence really is. So I did some of my own research into DNA and I learned quite a bit. In this case, there is only touch or transfer DNA. That means skin cells. So no blood, no semen, no saliva, just skin cells. Then I learned that the sample they collected was so small, it's not even enough to be scientifically accurate. It's only 18% of what is needed to be scientifically accurate. When there's not enough DNA, the analyst has to do what is called the stochastic effect, or guessing to fill in that missing information. Now, if you were on trial for your life, would you want that sort of evidence used against you? Probably not. Our U.S. military doesn't allow transfer DNA to be used in court cases due to its unreliability. So let's hear what Mick had to say about DNA and how it relates to this Idaho 4 case. We discussed this in simple terms, so I promise we're not going to make you fall asleep by listening to this discussion. I think you'll find it very fascinating.
Look, the answer is it depends, because of the fact that DNA in and of itself, doesn't really prove much, except that potentially it can identify a profile. It doesn't suggest how that profile has actually entered the crime scene. So it depends on what other, I suppose, direct or indirect or corroborative evidence is sitting there. A lot of emphasis is placed on DNA, and rightfully so, because it can be that linchpin that ties everything together.
Right.
But one of the issues, is that, it's part of a toolbox that you can use. Sometimes DNA, obviously in crime scenes, it's not present, or there isn't enough of it to be able to, obtain a suitable profile. So therefore, you can't rest on your laurels and, try to hope that some sort of DNA comes out.
Right.
Because you've got to have all the other evidence that also supports that DNA. And I liken it to, it at times it's the ace up the sleeve, but that ace is only as good as everything else that you're holding in your hand. If you don't have anything else in your hand, that ace is absolutely useless.
Right.
And DNA is the same. It can be that last part of the puzzle, and it confirms what potentially our suspicions are. But at times, mate, it's totally useless. But at other times, it's absolutely gold.
Yeah.
But
that's
one
fascinating.
One of the things I think is that we are now in an age where we rely too much upon it, and we think that if there's
Right.
DNA, it absolutely categorically has to say that person is responsible.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the case. All it says is that an item, for whatever that item is, has been linked to a person or a profile. But as said, it doesn't say how it got into the crime scene. It doesn't say when it got into the crime scene. It doesn't say who brought it into the crime scene. It just says it's within the crime scene.
Right. Yeah, that's how when the Idaho 4 case first started and I heard that there was DNA on a knife sheath that linked the suspect to the crime scene, I'm like, that end of story. I didn't even pay attention to it for a good 6-7 months until I kept seeing stuff about it. I'm like, what are they all talking about? What else do you need, And then when I started to learn about touch or transfer DNA, wow, that was an eye-opener, because that is not what I thought it was, And we talk about this in this case, about this button snap of the K-bar knife sheath, which apparently is brass, and the sustainability of DNA on a surface like that, and the fact that there was only 90 picograms of DNA, and I read that you need 500 for some reliable results. So I was hoping you could maybe shed a little bit of light on this transfer touch DNA.
Yeah, look, it is a very contentious issue and a very contentious area of, I suppose, forensic examination or analysis, because of the fact that, before I get into some of the ideas around like picograms, one of the things that we've got in Australia, especially, in my experience, is that when you're looking at a crime that's been committed and there's DNA or touch DNA or what we would call contact DNA on a transportable item. So a knife sheath is an extremely transportable item. Anybody could have placed that there.
Right.
Semen is different. A suspect's blood is different. Skin from under fingernails is something different. Whereas, a transportable item like a knife sheath, or, a hat that someone's wearing, it's very difficult to sit on that alone and say, well, here we go, we've got, a definite suspect.
Right.
So in Australia, especially, a lot of emphasis is placed on, yes, we've got DNA or a relevant sort of DNA profile, but it has to have everything else relevant as well. And I've led investigation cases where, the judges have thrown the matter out because of the fact that they've just effectively said, well, anyone could have put that there.
Sure.
Like there's no other evidence. There's no camera footage. There's no independent witness statement that just says, well, I found, Stephen's hat or Bill's hat or John's hat, in a car that was used for a robbery. Doesn't necessarily mean that, it was them that did it.
Right.
Anyone could have put it there. So it's contentious in the weight that's placed upon it within criminal proceedings, and especially here in Australia. Obviously, I can't speak for how things happen in the States, but certainly here, not as much weight is placed on it, especially if it's a transportable item. So if we've got a stolen motor vehicle, we're less interested in, the Coke bottle sitting in the back seat.
Right.
We're more interested in getting DNA from the steering wheel and the gear shift lever and the rear vision mirror where they change it and the inside of the door handle where they've opened and closed the door.
Right.
Because that suggests that they've actually, been in the car. There's more than one example or one piece of evidence that suggests they're there. It shows that potentially they were driving the stolen motor vehicle as opposed to just being a passenger, or throwing a Coke bottle in there.
Right.
But as far as, I suppose, touch contact goes, for those people who don't know, we could spend an hour talking about, DNA profiling, and I'm certainly not a forensic biologist, by any stretch of the imagination, but, I've been involved in enough, matters and been to court enough times where I've had to interpret, DNA results and been able to have to speak to, the judges on what we've obtained. So like a pictogram, is a billionth of a gram, and the cutoff, it's dependent upon, again, who you speak to. So the cutoff normally sits between 100 and 200 pictograms. So anything around that area, is effectively referred to as a low copy number sample. So the amount of pictograms is very low, and it falls below, a threshold that they basically need. And that threshold is there to determine that the DNA is enough to be able to test, but it's also enough to be able to be reproduced. So round about the 1 to 200 sits at that threshold. Above that, obviously, it makes it just so much easier. So anything above, 200 and closer to the 500, that you've mentioned, there's enough DNA there to reliably analyze it and reliably provide an ability to have that reproduced and to get to a result, that we can, I think the term is, reasonably suspect, that, it belongs to, a particular, profile or a particular person.
Right.
Below that 500, so in between 500 and 200, it becomes a little bit more difficult because every time you run a test, you might end up with a different result because there just isn't enough DNA there to have consistent replication.
Wow.
And part of the thing, obviously, with DNA is that you've got to be able to run the same test multiple times and come up with the same answer. If you're running the same test multiple times and each time you do it, you're getting a different answer, then obviously it's completely, unreliable.
Interesting. Yeah, and the prosecution doesn't want to give up their work on this, so that makes me wonder what's going on here. I mean,
which has me baffled, mate, because we simply could not get away with that in Australia. So we have part of a brief of evidence. So if we've arrested someone, we've interviewed them, we've charged them, they've been to court, and whether they're remanded or bailed, we have to provide full and frank disclosure. So if we're saying we've got DNA evidence that suggests, somebody was within a crime scene or somebody was involved in a crime, we can't withhold that. Lawfully, we have to give that to the defense because people are innocent until proven guilty.
Right.
And they have an ability to, from a human rights perspective, but also from a procedural fairness or natural justice, which is part of the rules of evidence, that they have a right to know who's making the allegation against them, and what that allegation, is involved in.
I also asked Mick about the brass button snap of the sheath. What I've read about the subject, about DNA not lasting very long on brass, has made me question this. There have been other channels here on YouTube that have reported on this, and the study that they usually reference doesn't use human DNA. It uses fish DNA. I'm not aware of a study that has used human DNA. However, in that study, the DNA only lasts 3 to 4 hours on brass. So I brought that up to Mick, and let's hear what he's got to say about it.
Well, to start with, I'm surprised that if DNA was on the brass clip button, why wasn't it anywhere else on that sheath?
Right.
The first question, that I would be asking, is, well, if you found DNA on a brass clip, which we know, we can talk about it, we know that, DNA, not so much fingerprints, obviously, but DNA on smooth metal surfaces in themselves and not just brass is challenging. But looking at it from a point where, well, if they've got DNA on a brass clip, then why is there not other DNA on the leather sheath and, other sort of aspects of it? The recovery of DNA and the amplification of obviously the DNA sample is very challenging on smooth surfaces. Usually on a smooth surface, you look, unless there's blood or saliva or something like that, from a touch contact perspective, you're really going to be looking more for fingerprints, especially if it's within a short time frame after, the commission of the offence.
Right.
So if the Idaho 4 murders took place and police were there within an hour, then quite possibly, you would be suggesting, yes, okay, we've got some relevant DNA because it's close to the time frame.
Right.
But the longer the time goes on, and especially if metal surfaces are open to the elements, degradation occurs and degrading of the DNA sample occurs, and it makes it not impossible, but less likely that you're going to get, DNA from it. You'll get DNA more from, rough or serrated or, type of surfaces. So when in the past we've done, DNA analysis on firearms, you'll get better DNA from, the handle of a pistol.
Right. Then the barrel.
Because it's,
right.
And then the barrel, or if the barrel's got serrations on it, then, you're going to get a better, DNA from that.
Right.
You might get fingerprints, from the smooth surfaces.
Sure.
But over time, obviously it makes it a bit more difficult. And brass is an interesting element or, compound because anything that contains copper or a copper alloy, we know, it's antimicrobial and it's antifungal and it's, a whole range of things, which is why coins now tend to be made from copper alloys. So your coins are the same as ours, they're copper on the middle and nickel on the outside, and what it does is it basically means that, if there was a huge transfer of DNA and germs and bacteria and stuff, everyone who picked up coins would be getting sick all the time.
Right.
And copper is specifically used, or copper alloys are specifically used because, germs can't last on there, and fungus doesn't grow on them, and they don't tarnish as well as they or what they used to. And
right.
So brass in itself is an interesting metal, because of the fact that it doesn't contain, or it doesn't hold a lot of DNA.
So think about that. If we're to believe the DNA evidence is real, we must suspend common sense for a minute. First of all, how does the sheath get underneath Maddie on the bed and underneath the sheets? If it was left behind by an attacker, I mean, I would think it would be sitting on top or maybe on the floor, but I guess it's possible. It just didn't seem very likely. The other thing is, if it was positioned there, how is there no other DNA on that sheath? Does that make any sense to you? I mean, this is a bed that somebody sleeps in. There were 2 people in the bed that were butchered. This had to be covered in bodily fluids, skin cells, and you name it, okay? How is there only Brian Kohberger's skin cells on that button snap on that bed? Makes no sense. And lastly, if DNA only lasts a few hours on brass, then how is it still there 12 hours later after these crimes were committed? If we're to believe their timeline of 4 a.m., we know that Detective Brett Payne showed up at 4 p.m., and if the crimes happened at 4 a.m., that's a long time for that DNA to still be present. Does that seem suspicious to you? I was interested to find out from Science Direct that DNA on our hands often originates from sources other than the hands themselves. So did someone else touch the snap and somehow got Brian's skin cells on their hands? Maybe from a gas station gas pump or a shopping cart at the grocery store. I mean, the possibilities are endless. Now, I asked Mick about the possibility of evidence being planted. Now, remember, I've mentioned this many times. My father worked in the law enforcement field for over 20 years. I've got friends that are currently in that field, and Mick himself was formerly a law enforcement officer. So the last thing we want to do is make these accusations, but the elephant is definitely in the room here with this one.
Oh, look, in theory, it'd be very easy, but the caveat would be they would have to have that person's DNA to start with.
Right.
But then again, that could be very easy because of the fact that,
yeah, if you knew where he lived and the car he drove.
Knew where he lived, car he drove, you've watched him have a drink, and you've taken, the cup away, or he smokes and he's thrown the cigarette butt away.
Right.
So it wouldn't be difficult to obtain it. It would be a huge extent to go to, to be able to do that. It's certainly not impossible, and it's certainly not something that hasn't happened in the past where, evidence has been tampered with and false evidence has been, placed in crime scenes to, fit a narrative that police, have got someone good for and they want to stitch them up, so they'll, stick their DNA in the crime scene.
Right.
It's certainly not out of the ordinary. I would like to think as a former police officer that they wouldn't do that.
Right.
But it might have been, somebody else who has some involvement in it.
Right.
Now, at the end of the day, the worst case scenario, the knife sheath did belong to the principal suspect, and that's fine. People are allowed to have knives and knife sheaths. The question is, how did it get into the crime scene?
Right.
Not whether or not it's his or it wasn't.
Right.
So if it was his, did he leave it somewhere? Did someone come and grab it? If we're going down that path,
right,
or that rabbit hole, then, how did it make its way into the crime scene, as opposed to the fact that, it may or may not be his, or may or may not have his DNA on it. But to answer your question, very easily, it's not a difficult concept to be able to do.
Mick also explained something I wasn't familiar with in regard to the term DNA shedders, as well as a new breakthrough in DNA collection that I found and discussed with him. So check this out.
It's something where males in particular, and it obviously relates to touch or contact DNA, males in particular, or some males in particular, can shed a lot of skin cells, and we shed skin cells all the time when we're touching things and moving around, etc. But some shed a lot more than others. And when I first started working in a sexual assault and child abuse team, when the forensic medical officers were going through the training, when they were going through the process of undertaking, physical examination on female sexual assault victims, we as males weren't allowed to be in the room, and that wasn't because of, embarrassment or,
right,
privacy issues or anything else like that. It was simply due to the fact that if we're in close proximity and you just happen to be one of these males that sheds a lot of skin cells, it might make its way onto clothing, and especially, underwear and those types of things that are, not external pieces of clothing. So then if that clothing is then gone and assessed, or analyzed, there's a potential that your DNA, will turn up on that clothing.
Interesting.
And then all of a sudden the question is asked of you, why is your DNA on a victim's, of sexual assault's underpants?
Right.
So one of the things that occurred was that we were, effectively we're simply not allowed, to be involved in being present when, medical examinations were being undertaken, on sexual assault victims because of that fact, because we shed.
Interesting. I read an article just today that they're coming up with a procedure to be able to collect DNA from the air in crime scenes. And I thought it was interesting because in the very early days of the Idaho 4 case, I remember seeing a heating and air conditioning work vehicle outside there. And I thought, I wonder what they're doing there after this crime. And then when I read this article, I thought, could it be possible that they were trying to extract like filters from the furnace to be analyzed for something like that? I mean, I know it sounds kind of out there, but when I read this article today, I mean, it's the technology's there. I just think they're testing it and, trying to refine it. I think it was up in Canada where it originated.
Well, yeah, I haven't heard of it, but, it's certainly conceivable.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things are airborne, so a lot of things we catch, colds and flus and et cetera, are airborne, and whether or not, that then sits, on a surface and, the crime scene guys can go in, and obtain a sample.
Right.
I don't, I can't say I know enough about air-conditioned filtration systems to be able to,
right.
To say yes, categorically, but it's certainly, in theory, a conceivable concept.
All that stuff about DNA is very interesting and relevant to this case. But I also wanted to talk to Mick about the crime scene. Now, the first issue I had in this case when it came to the crime scene was how many people were already there at the house that morning when law enforcement showed up. And how long had they been there? How many of them went in the house? Did any of them take pictures or video with their phones? Did the first two officers there from the Moscow PD who got there at about noon, did they thoroughly check everyone there? Get shoe impressions, IDs, fingerprints, make sure they didn't have cuts on their hands, all of that? I seriously doubt it. I bet they don't even have a list of the names of the people that were there. I suspect that's why the 911 call wasn't released. They claim that the phone was passed around during the call to the dispatcher. So who was there that morning? And why is it that law enforcement doesn't want us to know who it was? Now, according to the probable cause affidavit, the PCA, Detective Brett Payne with the Moscow PD was the lead investigator, and he showed up to the scene at 4 p.m. That's 4 hours after the first officers responded. Does that seem right to you? I mean, what else was going on that Sunday afternoon in Moscow that was more important than this, the biggest case in Idaho state history, for him to take that long to get there? So I asked Mick about it, and let's hear what he had to say.
Yes and no. Sorry to provide both answers.
That's all right.
It again, it's not knowing, I suppose, the specifics around the circumstance. So, like 4 hours tends to be a long time for any level of detective or, experienced investigator to attend. When I worked in a homicide team, or I worked in, what we had like a frontline detectives team, you have a time frame to be there, and there is always somebody on call. So even if, the homicide team was not, working at that particular time of the morning, so hypothetically 4 o'clock in the morning, there at least someone is on call and we can ring them, and then, within an hour, usually an hour and a half at the absolute max, depending on obviously how far they have to travel, a homicide investigation, at least 2 homicide detectives would attend. But from a detective perspective as well, and it depends again on the amount of, I suppose, detectives or, experienced investigators they have within that close proximity of the crime scene.
Right. Well, it was local cops, so they were in the same town. And it was 4 p.m. because the call came in at noon to 911, and then they were there at 4 p.m. I just thought that seemed like an awful long time, because this was, the first homicide in a few years that, at least that we know of. There's been some suspicious accidents that have happened. That's another story for another day. But this is a town of like 20, 30,000 people. There's not a lot of homicides going on. And these were local cops. I know you guys do it different in Australia with that, but that just seemed like a long time.
Yeah, it is, and if it's a local town and they've got detectives within their, local law enforcement, then the expectation is that they should have been there well and truly before 4 hours.
Right.
Unless there's only, I'm just, throwing things out here now, unless there's only 2 detectives who are in that detective's team, and they've just worked 7 days straight and they're on a day off.
Right.
And then they, they're away and someone has to call them back again.
Right.
Which does happen.
Oh, sure.
But where I worked, I was the team leader of what was called a response crime team. So we weren't a crime specific team. So we weren't like a homicide team or a sexual assault or an armed robbery team. We were a team of generic detectives. And whenever any serious crime occurred, we were the first detectives that were on scene. So general duties policing would turn up. They would say, okay, we've got a crime scene here where we need detectives. We would be the first people who were called, and we would normally be there within the hour.
Right.
It would then be an assessment by that team, which was 4 or 5 people, to say, yep, okay, this is definitely a homicide now. We'll, cordon and contain, we'll lock off the area, we'll create a crime scene, and then we'll have the actual homicide detectives come in. But we would do all the preliminary work around establishing crime scenes and making sure that, witnesses, if we had any, were separated and,
right.
et cetera.
Right.
But that's something that would occur very quickly.
Right.
It's not like, 5 hours before any detective turned up.
So you heard that right. Most departments would have detectives on the scene within the hour. So what was going on for those 4 hours? Maybe getting some evidence together? It could have been something like he was off that day and out of town. But given all the suspicion in this case, I'm having a difficult time giving this guy the benefit of the doubt. But it is certainly possible. I also asked Mick about the 3 unknown male DNA samples they found at the scene. 2 in the house, 1 outside on the glove they found on the sidewalk. This has bugged the hell out of me since I started following this case. Why in the world wouldn't they have those samples analyzed by now? Does that make any sense? Why wouldn't Brian Kohberger want to know whose DNA that was that they found there? I mean, Bill Thompson said something so ridiculous lately in regard to those unknown male DNAs is that they didn't have the lab results yet. Are you kidding me? 18 months after the crimes, you don't have the lab results back? When you were able to get virtual overnight results from Othram Labs when you sent the samples from the Kohberger trash can? That's ridiculous and completely unbelievable. So let's see what Mick had to say about these unknown male DNA samples.
Yeah, look, there's 2 things there. One is that you would presume that they have tested, and so that's the first, I suppose, caveat. The second one is I can understand at times that they don't release information in regards to, an active investigation. So, to come back to, I suppose, to the first point is that, if there's a rubber glove that's found, it's 2 weeks later, it's out in the open. The problem with DNA is, it degrades, and it degrades quite quickly, with the elements. Mm-hmm. So, is this a rubber glove that's just been left out in the open, it's been raining or it's snowed or, the sun's got onto it, and therefore the ability to obtain any DNA from that is questionable. It would also determine whether or not, they think that, the glove's being turned inside out, so one of the things that we would do on routine, and I'm sure, in your past, experience as well in your position, is that, you don't just wear 1 pair of gloves, you tend to wear 2 pairs of gloves.
Right.
And you double glove and whatever it is that, you're touching, if you think that there's going to be relative DNA, that first glove is just pulled off, it's turned inside out, you tie a knot in it. So if there's any DNA, it's trapped basically on the inside of that glove.
Right.
So we don't know whether this glove is just something someone has dropped. Is it a glove that belongs to one of the crime scene investigators who, on their way walking back to the car, they just inadvertently drop one of their gloves?
Right.
So I would like to think that they've tested it. They probably can't come up with anything that's worthwhile from it, potentially due to the time frame that's been left out in the open.
Right. But the 2 inside the house, those are
2 inside.
Curious.
Yeah, 2 inside the house. You would at least be examining. But it would also be looking at the relevance of of those samples, whether it's a mixed sample, whether there's various sort of I suppose profiles that are in there. Is it the profile of someone who lives in the house? They're there every day of the week.
Right.
And therefore you would expect their DNA to be on a door handle or, an oven door or a kitchen knife or whatever the circumstance is.
Right.
It doesn't exclude them, but, it just comes to the fact that you would expect those people's DNA to be there.
Right. It also makes me curious, that there was only 2. I mean, in a party house. So there's been a lot of suspicion that did they clean up and do something to alter the crime scene and maybe erase the signature of anybody that had been in that house. And that certainly makes you wonder that they only found 2 DNAs that they didn't, that weren't accountable. And that just seems odd to me.
Certainly. Yeah, it seems odd to me as well. Is that, because you've got, males coming through the house or even residing. Mm-hmm. Then, the fact that they've only found 2, additional or 2 samples that, they don't know who they belong to. Right. Is questionable. Yeah. It comes back to a couple of things. One, it might be the process or the technique that they use to obtain the DNA. Are they obtaining it from the right surface? Right. And you would think that they are. But again, it looks at, is it also a mixed sample. So if they've obtained, a male DNA from, let's say, an external or an internal door handle that to the bathroom that, 300 people might have touched in the last, 2 weeks, the likelihood of being able to get anything worthwhile from it, aside from the fact that, yes, they've obtained, what they think is a male DNA,
right,
then makes it, questionable. The other is DNA is only useful if you have something to reference it against. So if you've never been involved, in any criminal activity, or you've never worked in an environment where, your fingerprints and DNA have had to be taken as part of your job, like law enforcement and, corrections and other sort of entities, they wouldn't know. They wouldn't know who the DNA belongs to. They would just have now what is called a reference sample. So yes, we've found male DNA, but we have no idea who it belongs to.
Right. Another thing that has bothered me about this case is the amount of evidence that law enforcement gathered at the scene. How could it be that there were only 113 pieces of evidence collected? That seems like a very small number when you think about how messy things were there, according to the coroner, Kathy Mabbitt. I just recently did a case on the Murder Metal Mayhem podcast about the Toronto serial killer Bruce MacArthur, and they took like 1,800 samples from his apartment. So this is a 6-bedroom house. That just doesn't seem to make much sense. And I wondered how much cleaning had gone on in that 8-hour delay in calling 911. Is that why there's so little evidence? And I asked Mick about this due to his experience processing murder scenes. So here's what he had to say about it.
I agree to some extent, is that evidence has to be worthwhile. You've got to sample things or obtain things or be able to, get evidence that, is relevant and it's reliable. And you can go into a crime scene and you can, seize absolutely everything, and 9/10 of it might be absolutely worthless garbage.
Right.
So you're going to focus, your evidence gathering, techniques to things that are going to be more reliable to you and more relevant to the case. So 120, yes, it's short, it's, a small amount, but those 120, do we know whether they're, exceptional pieces of evidence, or, it's a piece of tissue paper that's left in the corner and they've just picked it up that really has nothing to do with anything.
Right.
So in those sort of circumstances, like latent shoe prints, it just, shoe prints, tire prints from vehicles, those types of things, again, are circumstantial. It can basically then go, oh, okay, the suspect wears this type of, Nike Air Jordan, and we find, a pretty similar, shoe print outside, of a bedroom door. It suggests that, it's circumstantial and it's related, but it's certainly not direct evidence that would prove or disprove anything.
Right.
But being able to obtain as much as you can, is the thing. And, we got taught something, very early on, with homicide investigations, is that effectively you believe nobody, you assume nothing, and you check everything.
Right.
Because everybody is a suspect.
I also thought it was strange that the Moscow PD rented a U-Haul truck and took a lot of the items from the house very quickly. They claimed it was to give things back to the families, but we saw mattresses tossed in the back of pickup trucks. Nothing seemed to be securely wrapped and secured in drums or something better than the way they were doing this. I mean, why would they do this? Why would the family want old mattresses? One looked like it was stained with what may have been blood. I mean, the families claim they never even got the stuff back, so it appears to have been a total lie. Why would they lie about something like that? Why would you remove items from an active crime scene? Have you ever seen a police department do something like that? Normally, a private contractor cleans up that kind of thing, and anything salvageable that the families want could be given to them then. If these were items that evidence was collected from, maybe there would be some use of them later on. Better scientific evidence or something. To just throw them in the back of a pickup truck is basically going to blow whatever's on them off and, into Never Land. It just doesn't seem like that makes any sense. And is that even a healthy way to get rid of items that appear to be stained with blood? When it comes to the DNA analysis, there are some things that many people don't know about it. Some recent news stories about laboratories being busted for improper analysis techniques that could put thousands of cases in jeopardy. Let's hear what Mick has to say about a major laboratory in Queensland that's in the middle of a mess like this, as well as a Colorado laboratory who's in some hot water over the same thing. When we place so much trust and weight in DNA analysis, this is shocking stuff to hear.
Yeah, it's probably been the worst DNA fiasco, in Australia's history.
Wow.
And for anyone who's interested, there's a podcast called Shandy's Story, which is put together by the lead, I suppose, crime reporter from the Australian newspaper. And it goes into quite some depth regarding, what has actually occurred. But in a nutshell, there was a young lady who was murdered called Shandy Blackburn, and the issues arose from they had a potential suspect, and the whole way through it, they've come out that the testing processes, the cover-ups within the lab, because the lab was just trying to cut corners and reduce time frames, and I suppose meet their expectations, has resulted in, possibly thousands upon thousands of DNA samples, if not criminal cases, that need to be completely reworked because of the fact that, the lab was so inept that they were finding no DNA, in blood samples. So one of the famous, I suppose, one of the early examples of it was that the crime scene officer who turned up, had obtained a blood sample, sadly from Shandy where she was lying, and has made notes, obviously in his book about, obtaining blood sample from, the gutter or wherever it was, and has sent that away. And the result from that has come back saying no DNA located.
Wow.
So it shows two things for me. One is that obviously something's happening at the lab where they can't find DNA from blood because of the, people don't bleed red cordial.
Right.
So you would presume that, an experienced forensic officer knows what blood is, and the second, is that, the forensic officer in question didn't turn around and go back to the lab and say, hang on a minute, you've made a mistake. I know what I sampled. I know I sampled blood from the victim. Go back and retest it.
Right.
And they didn't, and I've had, multiple occasions where I've had, DNA results come back from forensics. I've been unhappy with the outcome, and I've gone back to them and said, do it again, retest it again, look at something different, because I know what I sampled, I know what's been obtained.
Right.
So that's effectively, the whole process was around cost saving. It was about trying to fast track results, because at times, the results can be quite, time consuming to be able to come through. So they needed, a turnaround time quite quickly. If they reduce or change the process, bring in some, I don't know, maybe different automated processes that try to speed things up. Mm-hmm. But what it's resulted in is that a massive failure where it's probably got to the point where, there's either innocent people who are sitting in prison because of the fact that, the DNA, lab stuffed up so badly, or conversely, people have walked free
Right.
when they're guilty, and you've got people walking around who've committed some terrible crimes.
Wow. How many cases did you mention that this affects?
There's potentially thousands.
Wow.
So we've had a retired former appeals high court judge, a gentleman by the name of Walter Sofronoff, do a commission of inquiry, so an internal, like a royal commission, inquiry into it, that took, the best part of 12 months. And, he has just found huge issues. He's found that the management at the lab, had openly lied. They'd lied to, police. They'd lied to the health department, which actually ran the lab. They lied under oath during his questioning.
Oh my God!
Wow. So if someone doesn't go to prison for this, then I would be amazed. But they've had to. Queensland Forensic Lab has had to send thousands of samples to other labs around the country. Dating back, I think to about 2013.
Wow.
To be able to say, okay, can you now redo these fellas, because I think we've stuffed up.
Wow. And we're going through the same thing here in Colorado. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation, with forensic scientist Missy Woods, who's been alleged she manipulated or omitted DNA results in hundreds of cases over a 30-year career. Have you heard anything about that one, Mick?
No, I hadn't. Not until obviously you'd mentioned in the questions you sent through. I had a bit of a look at it, and it appears to be, very similar.
Yeah.
Very similar. I think hers, I can't speak for her, but ours tended to be issues in and around the ability to do sampling correctly. So the sampling was undertaken incorrectly, and no one was looking at it saying, hang on a minute, I think we're doing this wrong. And then there was the I suppose the follow-on cover-up, whereas my preliminary look at hers tends to be, she's purposely omitted, or included things to fit whatever narrative, is being put forward.
I also asked Mick about the way DNA evidence was tested in the Idaho 4 case and the 2,500-mile trip to Pennsylvania to dig through the Koberger family garbage to collect a sample. I mean, why didn't they just pull Brian in while he was in Pullman to get a sample from him then? Why let him leave the area? And I almost wonder if maybe they thought he was going to lead them to something or somewhere he had stashed stuff, but I don't know. It seems crazy to me. And they knew that his dad was with him, so did they think his dad was in on it? Just very strange. So I asked Mick about it. Let's hear what he says.
Yeah, look, again, DNA testing is full of issues. There's different ways to test DNA depending on, the sample that they obtain. So depending on whether it's a touch DNA, sample, and there's only a small amounts of it compared to, how they would undertake potentially like a semen or a blood test, which, you would presume obviously contains more DNA. So it can come down to different labs doing different testing based on, what sample that they have. The question that I ask in relation to this is, if the Idaho lab has only found the one sample on the button and nothing on the actual sheath, then when it's passed on to the FBI, are the FBI just reanalyzing or re-examining the sample that originally was taken, or were they examining the entire sheath?
Good question.
Because if they're examining the entire sheath, obtaining DNA, from a surface usually, not always, but usually contains, using distilled water, and Q-tips, and you wet an area, to dilute it. You use a Q-tip, run it around, collect obviously whatever is there, and then, place that into, some sort of sealable, tube or, process. If they're re-examining the exact same surface, so if they've received the the sheath and they're looking at that same brass button, I would be skeptical that they would find anything off it because of the fact that it's already been examined and distilled water's been placed on it and all sorts of stuff. I would also question whether or not the process that they've used to obtain the evidence from the actual, leather in the sheath itself. Because again, it not always, but it usually involves some sort of, liquid or wet surface to be able to, to obtain a sample, using a Q-tip. So is it possible that one lab misses it and another lab picks it up? Absolutely, it's possible.
Okay.
But it would depend on what it is that they're actually testing, how they're testing it, and whether or not, the FBI have actually got the sheath and they're redoing it themselves, or they're just retesting the sample that, the Idaho lab to start with, because some labs have better equipment than others. Small regional laboratories, don't have the same sort of infrastructure. For example, with us, with the federal police, which is akin to what the FBI is, we would have the best forensic labs in the country. Right. And we would have an ability to do things that some of the more smaller, more regional laboratories wouldn't be able to do.
Right.
So it certainly is conceivable, but whether or not it's probable, is the thing that questions it for me.
Right.
And following Brian 2,500 miles or wherever it was, you've got to have a certain degree of suspicion that this person is at the top of the pecking order, as being the person who's involved. We've done in the past, and I've directly been involved in what we call covert DNA samples, which are where we have two reference samples. We don't know who the sample belongs to. We've got other evidence or information that suggests that someone's, responsible for the crime. We would follow that person around, surveil them, find out where they are. If they're smoking a cigarette, wait till they leave, pick up the discarded cigarette butt, and then go and have that examined and compare that, because now it's a known sample because we know who it came from, against whatever the reference sample was.
Right.
We couldn't use that known sample in court because it's covertly obtained. So if they came back as being, a match, we would then have to, apply to a magistrate or a judge to get a forensic or appropriate forensic DNA sample from somebody.
Right.
And then obviously we would obtain the lawful, sample. But it's not unknown that, police or law enforcement will go through people's trash. I know it's different in the States that once you put your bin out, you've basically relinquished all ownership of that property.
Right.
Where that is simply not the case in Australia. So until the garbage truck comes and collects it and picks it up and takes it to the refuse, station, it's still the property of the owner.
Interesting.
So we can't just walk up and start going through people's bins.
Right.
I've been involved in matters where, we suspect, that something has occurred. We're looking for, evidence, and we've had to obtain a warrant, and once the garbage truck has collected the rubbish, we've basically had to follow them back out to the refuse station and go through the rubbish there. And again, all that does is it just provides a reference sample. It's you comparing sample, that they've got on file, against something that's come out of, Brian's family's trash, to then try to find some, relevant match. Right. But for us in Australia, that's not evidentiary. It's just intelligence. We have to then go and lawfully obtain a DNA sample from them, and that's usually via a magistrate or a judge.
I also asked Mick about the IgG, investigative genetic genealogy testing that was done in the Idaho 4 case. This is apparently how law enforcement got Brian Kohberger on their radar. I don't agree with that claim, but that's what they're saying. Many people around the world have issues with the government using our personal data like this. It is a bit of an ethical question, but I can see the benefit. I mean, that was how they brought down the Golden State Killer out there in California. But there are genealogy sites like Ancestry and 23andMe that don't allow that stuff. So I'm on the fence in this argument. I can certainly see both sides. So Mick breaks this down in simple terms and also talks about how Australia looks at IgG evidence.
It's certainly not something you can do in Australia. I know that much.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. So it would appear that in some states with you guys it is legal.
The military doesn't allow it here in the United States. They don't allow it.
No, so here it's certainly not. But obviously over there's some states that do allow it. And it's obviously access to genetic or genotypical databases. Here, it would be hard pressed for us to be able to obtain it without, a lawful warrant. So we could get access to it. What relevance it would cause or it would provide, I'd have to question it. Unless it was something, that was a cold case or a historic case, where, I'm then trying to find someone who's committed an offence and potentially it was 40 years ago and they could be dead now. So, you're trying to get some genealogical match.
Right.
I think it's what they used, the Golden State Killer, was one of the examples, where they were able to do that.
Yeah, that kind of opened it up. And in this case, with only the 90 picograms, I'm just wondering how reliable, because I know you were talking about having to replicate it and do this. I wonder how reliable would that IgG information be when you're dealing with something so small as the sample they got in this case?
Yeah, look, if they got something from Brian's father, because obviously Y chromosomes, are passed on from generational, from father to son and vice versa, that if they found or undertook an analysis and they knew it was the father's DNA or the brother's DNA, they can find that Y chromosome, similarity because it's obviously passed down. So it would certainly, be useful, but I question the means and the reasoning why they would have to, travel 200 or 2,500 miles.
Right. Why couldn't they just pull Brian in and do a buccal swab on him there in town?
Absolutely.
Why let him drive all the way across the country? It just doesn't make any sense. And that's why this whole case is just shrouded in this kind of stuff,
Yeah, and they're not obtaining a evidentiary sample. They're still only obtaining a reference sample. So they're trying to refer something back to whatever it is that they've got. If they thought that, he was, absolutely, good for it, then why didn't they bring him in, and get a lawfully obtained sample? So then they would have a definitive DNA requirement. I'm sure that they probably followed him around for the best part of a month or 2 months. Mate, pick up a cigarette he's discarded. If he's drinking, from a cup in a restaurant, go in and grab it. If he throws away a Coke can that he's been drinking, pick it up. Going through the trash is going to identify a broad range of samples that may be his or obviously may be related to his relatives. Whereas if they've got him under surveillance, why not just either A, pick him up, and do it lawfully, or secondly, just follow him around and grab something he's discarded.
Right. I think I'm just questioning, how did they even know that Brian was the source of or his family was the source of that original DNA sample to even get to the point where you're checking it against his dad? That's where I'm struggling with it. That small amount, I just don't know how reliable it would be.
So unless there was an example or a situation, so they've obtained what they think is Brian's DNA from this brass button off the knife sheath. and they've got nothing in the state or national database that provides a profile that's a match. And then it's like, okay, so without following him, can we go out to a genealogical society and determine whether or not someone has done a test my genes and who are my family, where my family tree come from.
Right.
And they've done that. And then potentially there's a link somewhere, how tentative, between, Brian's DNA and someone associated with Brian's family, on the male side of things. So potentially that's something that they could have. Obviously, the biggest issue with this is, they're not releasing a lot of information around how they've got things. So that potentially could be. So then they've found some tentative match between the DNA off the brass button and some genealogical holding that is linked to Brian's family. So, they've put 2 and 2 together and come up with 10, and then seen some conclusion, jumped to it and followed him, 2,500 miles away to try to obtain a sample, from covertly from the trash. If they thought, this is me thinking as a detective, if I thought that he was that good for it and there was no other suspects, then I'd be picking him up. I'd be obtaining a sample from him, plus I'd be going to the family, and being upfront and saying, I need a sample of your DNA to exclude or to include, or, go there and obtain a warrant to get the family's DNA. So then I've got things that are lawful. No one can question it in court. No one can come around a questioning of how did you obtain that? Could have been anyone's DNA thrown in the trash can.
Right.
So there's ways and means about doing it. But linking Brian or the DNA on that button to Brian, is posing a question, because did they have a reference sample to start with?
Right.
Or did they just use this genealogical process to say, well, we've got a bit of a loose link, and therefore we'll follow that up because we have nothing concrete or tangible.
Here's a bit of a wrap up with Mick about this case that I think you'll find interesting. So many of us question the Moscow PD, the Idaho State Police, as well as the FBI. It seems to us that things just aren't right here. So having Mick's perspective is interesting, especially from someone who is not far from the U.S. that can speak much more candidly about the subject.
Look, there's always advancements, and hopefully those advancements do a couple of things. One, the advancement has provided evidence that courts can't challenge, because of the fact that it reduces, less error. And secondly is that, with these advancements in techniques, then, it provides, a better profile or a better outcome. They're incredibly smart people, some of these, laboratory folks who, come up with these tests. Once upon a time, remember, we used to, feel the bumps on people's head
Right.
to determine whether, phrenology or whatever it was called, to determine whether, determine whether, they were crazy or they were mad or they were the person who committed the crime based on a bump on a head.
Right.
So to go from that, obviously, through then fingerprinting, which is still, extremely reliable, to now into DNA, it's obviously a progress, and let's hope, that they're at a point where, they can reduce those errors. But my concern is that we just treat DNA as it is, and that is just one piece of a puzzle. It is not the whole and sole answer to everything, and it's got to be linked to, what it is that we're investigating. As I said, it might provide us a profile of whose DNA it matches, but it doesn't give us any indication of how that DNA entered a crime scene. And that's what we need to know, because
Right.
as we've that we discussed previously, and as you've discussed in some of your other podcasts, a knife sheath, under sheets, a bed that's been slept in multiple times. When was the last time the sheets were changed? With a deceased female victim on top bleeding. Yeah, you got to question how a knife sheath got underneath someone and then underneath a sheet.
Right.
They're the issues for me. So I'm less concerned about whether or not the DNA was Brian's, because it could be his, because he might own a K-bar knife and he might have had 10 of them and one of the sheaths has gone missing.
Right.
Doesn't mean that he's responsible.
Right.
And it certainly doesn't mean, or give any indication of how the sheath got underneath the sheet, underneath the deceased victim.
Right. Yeah, very, very suspicious, but really, really interesting to talk with you, Mick. I always enjoy our conversations, and I do appreciate you shedding some light on this somewhat confusing topic. And I did want to give law enforcement, the benefit of the doubt in this case, but they just keep one thing after another, just a lot of suspicion. And I hope during the trial it all makes sense, but I have my concerns with this one. So
yeah, so do I. Look, it something smells, and whether that is gross negligence, and because they've made so many mistakes, they don't want to put their hand up and say we've made all these mistakes, so therefore they're just going to continue with this bullshit story, because they don't want to be seen to be inept, because obviously if it comes out that they've made all these errors, then you got the issues around wrongful imprisonment and unlawful arrest and a whole raft of things where there's a litany of litigation that there's going to come their way. So whether it's just negligence, whether it's the fact that they've got people on the job who, might be reasonable detectives, in other areas, but just don't understand the nuances around undertaking a homicide investigation.
Right.
We don't know, because obviously, as you mentioned earlier, one of the other guys has only been a detective for 2 years.
Right.
So they've placed what you would think is a relative rookie, on a serious matter. Mm-hmm. But in saying that, he might be a fantastic investigator who knows his stuff back to front. But I would think that you would have, especially with a 4-person homicide, you'd have a lot of experienced people, and you would drag in people from other jurisdictions to give you a hand if you didn't have that experience.
That was a lot of information to soak in, and I hope you guys found that informative. I wanted to get the perspective of a police officer with experience in processing crime scenes, and also someone who understood DNA. To some of us, when we hear people talk about DNA, they either don't know what they're talking about or they talk over the heads of the average person. I wanted to do it in simple layman's terms that we can all understand. I mean, I'm just a high school graduate. I'm not a scientific expert by any means. Well, thank you guys for checking out this episode of True Crime Deep Cuts. I want to thank Mick for doing the interview with me. He's a fun guy to talk to and extremely knowledgeable on the subject. I'm sure I'll have him back for other discussions. Now, there is a variety of content here on the channel. If you like shorter stuff, I've got the 666 seconds videos, where each video is less than 666 seconds or 11 minutes and 6 seconds. Plus, I've done interviews with several of the YouTube true crime creators. I did an interview with Dr. Catherine Ramsland. That was Brian Koberger's professor at DeSales. I've done several other things on here. There's also the Murder Metal Mayhem podcast that you can listen to from here on this channel. And there's videos of some of the feature segments we do on the channel as well. I would like to thank the members of the Hornseye Club. You guys are awesome. I appreciate your support. And I want to thank everybody who watches these videos. We'll see you next time for another episode of True Crime Deep Cuts.